I was standing on a cold factory floor in Salt Lake City, stabilizing a robotics failure that threatened to shut down an entire production line, when my phone lit up with a 4-minute call that ended my 11 years of work. No warning, no gratitude. Just a quiet, surgical cut in the middle of a crisis I was holding together with my own hands. They thought replacing me with automated protocols would make them unstoppable. They had no idea what I'd built, or what would happen without me. If you've ever been dismissed by someone who didn't understand your value, stay with me. And if this story resonates, subscribe and tell me your experience in the comments. For 11 years, I was the quiet force behind Ironvale Manufacturing Group's entire production network. The person crews called before dawn, after midnight, and every hour in between because I was the only one who understood how all 6 of our facilities breathed together. I didn't come from an Ivy League program or a consulting firm. I came from the floor, from steel-toed boots, burned palms, and long nights learning how machines behave when they're pushed past their limits. By the time I earned the title Director of Integrated Production Networks, I'd built something far bigger than a resume. I'd built a system that worked because the people inside it trusted me to see what they couldn't. Each facility across the Mountain West had its own heartbeat. Salt Lake City handled robotics assembly, a maze of synchronized arms that needed constant calibration. Cheyenne specialized in composite manufacturing, where a temperature shift of 3 degrees could ruin an entire batch. Flagstaff powered our renewable energy components. Pueblo handled precision metals. Boise coordinated our AI-guided final assembly. And Denver served as headquarters. Though I spent so little time in that building, most people assumed I lived inside a factory. What made our grid powerful wasn't the size of the plants, it was the timing between them. A robotics actuator delivered 12 minutes late to Cheyenne meant a composite panel couldn't cure properly. A metals delay in Pueblo could stall the entire renewable line in Flagstaff. Boise's AI assembly required perfect data from the 5 upstream facilities, and if even one number slipped, everything downstream collapsed like a row of dominoes. My job wasn't to bark orders or approve spreadsheets. My job was to keep the dominoes from falling. For years, I knew every supplier's habits, every crew chief's strengths, every machine's personality. I could feel when a line shift in Flagstaff was about to cause a backlog in Boise even before the data confirmed it. That instinct came from years of late-night walkthroughs, real conversations with the people who actually touch the machines, and 1,000 crises I learned to predict before they surfaced. People think operations is about processes. It isn't. It's about relationships, between machines, between schedules, between human beings doing the kind of work no algorithm has truly mastered. And because I understood those relationships intimately, our grid thrived. For a decade, we had near-flawless delivery rates, record client satisfaction, and the kind of internal stability most companies our size never experience. The truth was simple. Ironvale ran the way it did because I held the map in my head. Not a corporate map, a living one. I didn't flaunt it. I didn't demand recognition. I didn't expect any. I believed that as long as I kept the system running, leadership would at least respect the role that made their numbers look so good at quarter's end. But people in corner offices often confuse quiet competence with replaceability. They see smooth operations and assume the system runs on its own. They never imagine that the reason they sleep at night is because someone like me hasn't slept in years. Looking back, the warning signs were there. The new attitude in Denver, the shift in language, the way efficiency started sounding like a threat instead of a compliment. I didn't know it then, but the world I'd built was already being priced, evaluated, and targeted by people who had never once walked a factory floor. They saw a system. I saw a living organism. And soon, they would find out exactly what happened when they removed the person who kept it alive. I should have sensed the shift the moment Celeste Granger walked into the Denver headquarters conference room wearing that polished consultant smile, the kind that tells you she already decided what's wrong with your world before she's even seen it. Victor Stroud, our CEO, hovered beside her like a kid who just bought the newest gadget and couldn't wait to show it off. He introduced her as our new Vice President of Systems Optimization, a title so vague it practically screamed disruption. Celeste talked about predictive models, automation-first strategies, and algorithmic coordination frameworks with the confidence of someone who had memorized every buzzword in her playbook. She spoke like she believed factories shouldn't need people at all, as if human oversight was an unfortunate leftover of an outdated era. I listened, not threatened but curious. People like her usually meant well. They just didn't understand what happens outside climate-controlled offices. Still, something in the way she kept glancing at me suggested she had already marked me as a relic. When the meeting ended, Victor pulled me aside with that paternal tone he used when he was asking for something he didn't quite understand. He told me to collaborate closely with Celeste and help her modernize our operations. Modernize, a word that can either mean improvement or erasure depending on who says it. I wasn't naive. I knew consultants often arrive with a mandate hidden behind their slides, but I also knew the system I'd built was resilient. I'd tested it, refined it, lived inside it, so I welcomed her questions at first. But the questions never stopped. Then they evolved into suggestions, then into proposals, and then into evaluations. She questioned why I personally oversaw inter-facility timing when proprietary dashboards could predict bottlenecks. She questioned why Cheyenne and Salt Lake City required weekly cross-team coordination calls when automation could standardize communication channels. She questioned why I personally intervened in time-sensitive supplier negotiations when vendors should adjust to systematic protocols. Each time, I explained the same thing in different ways. Our grid wasn't a machine you could program. It was a living sequence of relationships between temperature-sensitive composites, robotics timing delays, supplier reliability quirks, weather patterns, and human instinct. And each time, she nodded politely with the patronizing patience of someone listening to an outdated manual. Over the next months, she created report after report showing how my centralized oversight was inefficient, overly personalized, and non-scalable. She presented the idea that each facility should be independently optimized under her algorithm-based directives, eliminating what she called coordination redundancy. She described my job as if it were an outdated switchboard that needed replacing with automated routing software. The worst part wasn't that she misunderstood my work. It was that Victor believed her. Celeste had something I never cared to cultivate: optics. She crafted sleek presentations with futuristic diagrams and glowing projections. She used phrases like self-evolving systems and predictive load balancing, words that sound expensive enough to impress people who don't know the difference between real-time crisis management and a theoretical workflow. I could see Victor absorbing every sentence like gospel. His company, his legacy, suddenly seemed outdated to him. Celeste promised a future where systems ran themselves, where Ironvale didn't need someone like me making judgment calls at 2 a.m. There's something dangerous about leaders who want to believe in magic solutions. They stop noticing the people holding everything together. One afternoon, after a long walkthrough in Pueblo, I returned to Denver to find Celeste in my workspace, my actual workspace, flipping through my hand-drawn coordination maps as if she were evaluating museum artifacts. She smiled and said, "This level of manual oversight won't be necessary once the new model is finalized." Not if. Once. It was then I realized she wasn't analyzing the system. She was mapping out how to remove me from it. The question wasn't whether a blow was coming. It was when, and in what form. I didn't know that the answer would arrive in the most humiliating way possible, in the middle of a crisis, before dawn, with my hand still inside a failing machine. The night everything unraveled started like countless others in my career, quiet, cold, and tense, with only the hum of machines and the sharp scent of overheated metal filling the Salt Lake City robotics bay. A critical actuator on line 4 had failed mid-cycle, threatening to stall an entire batch of assemblies that were already behind schedule thanks to a supplier delay. I was elbow-deep inside the housing, guiding 2 techs through a delicate recalibration sequence when my phone buzzed. I glanced at the time, 3:09 a.m. Calls at that hour weren't unusual, but the caller ID stopped me cold. It wasn't a facility manager. It wasn't a crew chief. It wasn't even a vendor. It was Victor Stroud. CEOs don't call people like me at 3 a.m. unless something has either gone terribly wrong or someone has made a terrible decision. I wiped my hands on my work pants, stepped away from the machinery, and answered. Victor, I'm in the middle of stabilizing Salt Lake's robotics line. Can this wait a few minutes? His voice came through flat, rehearsed, and disturbingly calm. Hadley, I'm calling to inform you of an immediate restructuring that impacts your position. I felt an instant drop in my stomach, like missing a step in the dark. What restructuring? He continued without acknowledging the edge in my voice. Effective immediately, your role will be retired as part of our transition to a distributed, automation-forward coordination model. All operational authority will be transferred to Vice President Granger. Behind me, the robotics arm clanked softly as the techs waited for my guidance. A live crisis was unfolding in real time, and Victor was reading lines from a script. Victor, Salt Lake's failure is affecting Cheyenne's composites timing, and Boise's assembly queue is already backing up. This is an active chain reaction. We can talk after— No, the transition takes effect now, for administrative efficiency. The phrase sliced through me. Administrative efficiency. That was the excuse they reached for, while I was literally preventing a multi-state production delay. I stared at the machinery behind me, the blinking warning lights, the half-assembled units, the techs who were watching me with a mix of confusion and fear. So you're firing me in the middle of a crisis I am actively containing? This decision was made after thorough evaluation, he replied, as if reading from a legal statement. We need you to transfer all credentials immediately. My pulse hammered in my throat. Who is coordinating the grid tonight? Each facility manager will handle their own operations under Celeste's supervision, he said. She has full confidence in her system protocols. I almost laughed, not because anything was funny, but because the absurdity hit me like a physical blow. No one, not even our most experienced managers, had training and cross-facility timing. They didn't know which robotics calibrations affected Cheyenne's curing windows. They didn't know that Pueblo's precision metal shift was already at capacity. They didn't know that the Flagstaff renewable line was relying on the very components currently paused behind me. Celeste had data, but she didn't have understanding. And now Victor was betting the entire company on her belief that systems run themselves. I inhaled slowly, steadying the trembling in my fingers. Victor, do you need a briefing on the current crisis before I shut down access? That won't be necessary, he said. Celeste's protocols cover all necessary contingencies. I pressed my lips together. There was no point arguing with someone who had already decided that numbers on a slide outweighed 11 years of instinct, experience, and lived knowledge. Understood, I said. 2 syllables. Calm, controlled, deadly. Behind me, the actuator alarm beeped, signaling another timing slip. I muted the call, gave the techs the final steps they needed to finish without me, and then unmuted. I'll begin transferring access. Thank you, he said, strikingly relieved, as if he had expected me to fight. I didn't fight. Not then, not in that moment. I ended the call, stared at my reflection in the darkened control panel, and felt something inside me settle. Not break, settle. They believed they were cutting me out of a system that would keep running without me. They believed Celeste's dashboards could predict what my judgment had prevented for a decade. They believed this was the end of my influence. But they had just removed the only person who understood how all 6 facilities held each other together. And whether they realized it or not, the countdown to Ironvale's collapse had already begun. I stayed in the Salt Lake Robotics Bay just long enough to finish the last hand signal to the techs, then stepped into the hallway where the noise dropped away and the reality of what had just happened settled over me like a heavy, suffocating blanket. I'd been fired before dawn, during an active crisis, with no transition plan and no acknowledgement of what the decision meant for the entire grid. And now, because Victor insisted on administrative efficiency, I had to hand over the operational keys to someone who had never set foot in a facility after midnight, never smelled burning hydraulic fluid, never felt a machine shudder, and known instantly what was about to fail. I opened the secure tablet and began the transfer sequence, revoking my own access, granting new credentials, rerouting decision authority. Every screen felt like erasing a piece of myself. 11 years of adjustments, notes, adaptive calibrations, emergency overrides. Everything I'd built was being handed to someone who didn't know why half those settings existed. And as I worked, the facility managers started calling, first Cheyenne, then Pueblo, then Boise. Messages stacked like falling bricks. Hadley, are you seeing this queue? The timing isn't matching the last update. Flagstaff says their temperature baselines don't align with what they were told. I stared at the phone, each vibration another reminder of the responsibility I no longer had the authority to fulfill. I couldn't answer, not because I didn't want to, but because Victor had made it clear. I was out. The grid was someone else's problem now. I switched the phone to silent, not out of bitterness, but because it hurt to hear people ask me for guidance I was suddenly forbidden to give. At 3:42 a.m., as I was finalizing the last credential transfer, a notification popped up. Incoming call, Celeste Granger. I considered ignoring it, but professionalism won. I accepted. Her voice was bright, rehearsed, a little too eager. Hi, Hadley. Victor said you'd walk me through the transition briefly. Briefly, the word stung. She was stepping into a world she did not understand, and she wanted the Cliff's Notes version. Still, I stayed factual. I explained the robotics delay in Salt Lake, the curing dependencies in Cheyenne, the precision bottleneck in Pueblo, the renewable assembly risk in Flagstaff. Each time I paused, she responded with the same answer. The system can compensate. She meant her dashboards, her models, her automated alerts, but I could already see the cracks forming. She asked why the robotics line required a non-standard timing offset, because she didn't know I had implemented that offset 3 years ago, after discovering a microvariance in the actuator tolerance that only affected components destined for the composite curing molds in Cheyenne. She asked why the Pueblo metals shift started 17 minutes earlier than the official schedule, because she didn't know that the supplier in Farmington always delivered slightly ahead of schedule, and adjusting the workflow prevented overcooling. She asked why the Flagstaff renewable line had temperature protocols outside the standard model, because she didn't know that the materials reacted unpredictably to humidity in early spring, and we were right in that window. I wasn't angry. I wasn't spiteful. I was simply watching someone try to run a system she believed was linear, when in reality it was a web held together by thousands of tiny, invisible adjustments learned through experience. When I finished, she said, "This seems more complicated than the reports indicated." And just like that, she confirmed everything I already knew. I completed the transfer, locked the tablet, and handed it to the night supervisor. As I walked out of the facility into the cold, early morning air, the sky was just beginning to lighten. I paused beside my car, looking back at the building that had consumed over a decade of my life. They believed removing me made the company stronger. What they didn't understand was that coordination wasn't a title, it was a skill, and by the time they realized what they had lost, the damage would already be irreversible. By the time I reached my apartment just after dawn, I already sensed the first shockwaves moving through the grid. It started subtly, an unexpected update from a former colleague on LinkedIn asking if Salt Lake had really pushed the robotics line into full cycle mode without recalibration. That alone wouldn't have caused panic. But the timestamp told me everything. The wrong settings had been applied long after my access was revoked. Celeste's system protocols had taken over, and they had already made their first mistake. At 6:41 a.m., the robotics sequence that supplied Cheyenne's composite molds completed a run using generic factory parameters. What Celeste didn't know, what she never asked about, was that those molds required a precision variance I had developed over months of trial and error. Without it, the parts looked fine but cured unevenly. 2 hours later, Cheyenne flagged a batch of panels showing micro-warping. They weren't usable, not for advanced composites, not for the clients who demanded perfection, but the system didn't stop. It simply kept producing, unaware that the flaw it created was now replicating across the entire queue. At 8:20 a.m., a crew chief in Cheyenne texted me, "Please tell me you're seeing this. We can't reach Denver." I didn't reply. I couldn't. By 9:03 a.m., Pueblo hit their first failure. Their precision metals shift had been rescheduled automatically by Celeste's optimization model, pushing their output window dangerously close to a high heat period. Pueblo wasn't supposed to operate full capacity after 9 a.m. The facility's temperature control system struggled to maintain stability past that point. Everyone who worked there knew this. The model did not. By 10:12 a.m., half their batches were out of spec, and the metals shipment destined for Flagstaff had already missed its integration slot. Without those metals, Flagstaff's renewable components couldn't complete their final assembly, and once Flagstaff slipped, the entire downstream timeline fell apart. At 11:05 a.m., Boise sent a facility-wide alert. Their AI assembly queue couldn't process the incoming data packets from Cheyenne because the parameters no longer matched the expected standards. It wasn't an equipment issue. It wasn't a supplier issue. It was a coordination failure. A cascading misalignment created by system-led decisions that did not understand the consequences of their own actions. Meanwhile, Celeste issued directives from Denver telling facilities to stay aligned with protocol and avoid improvisation. Improvisation was what normally prevented disasters. Without it, every small error was amplified. At 12:17 p.m., I received a message from a Flagstaff engineer who had never once contacted me outside formal channels. Hadley, we're losing sync with 3 suppliers. Did something happen to oversight? Nothing is lining up? I sat on my couch staring at the message. The urge to fix everything clawed at me. I could see the failures unfolding like a blueprint burned into my mind. Every misstep, every missing adjustment, every delay compounding into something larger. But I didn't move. This was no longer my system. They had chosen to dismantle it. They had chosen to believe that coordination was a luxury instead of a necessity, and now the bill was coming due. By 1:46 p.m., the situation had reached a point where even Celeste couldn't pretend her dashboards were handling it. I knew that because my phone lit up with her name again. I didn't answer. At 2:08 p.m., a news alert appeared. Ironvale experiences temporary production disruptions at multiple facilities. Temporary. That word wouldn't age well. At 3:26 p.m., Cheyenne shut down their mold line entirely to prevent further material waste. At 3:52 p.m., Pueblo halted metals processing because temperatures were too unstable. At 4:11 p.m., Flagstaff stopped its assembly line after the failed metal shipment caused a system-wide recalibration fault. At 4:39 p.m., Boise's AI line entered full stoppage after receiving incompatible inputs from 3 separate facilities. At 5:59 p.m., the grid officially fractured. None of the facilities could determine what the others were producing. No one knew which schedule was accurate, which shipment was valid, or which output could still be salvaged. Everything depended on timing, and the timing was gone. At 6:05 p.m. on the dot, the Ironvale production grid, a $6.9 billion operational ecosystem, collapsed under the weight of mistakes that only one person had ever known how to prevent. Me. 12 hours and 50 minutes after I was fired, the system that once ran like a living organism without a heartbeat of delay now lay broken across 6 states, and they hadn't even reached the worst part yet. That was still coming. The moment when they finally realized they needed the very person they threw away. The first call came at 6:21 p.m., right as the last of the grid collapsed. I was standing in my kitchen, staring at the blinking microwave clock because it somehow felt steadier than everything unraveling across 6 states when my phone lit up with Celeste's name. I let it ring out. A minute later, she called again. Then she switched to texts. Short, frantic bursts that had none of the polished confidence she once wielded like armor. Hadley, we need your input. There are discrepancies we didn't anticipate. Please call me. Discrepancies. She still didn't understand. This wasn't a spreadsheet error. This was the natural consequence of believing a system could replace the person who taught it how to breathe. At 6:37 p.m., she left a voicemail. Her tone was strained, clipped, the sound of someone trying not to show panic. Hadley, I'm Sure, you've heard. We're dealing with coordination irregularities across several facilities. The automated protocols are generating conflicting instructions, and the teams are struggling to maintain stability. Victor and I would greatly appreciate your perspective. Perspective. She wanted me to explain the fire she had poured gasoline on. I didn't listen to the rest. At 7:04 p.m., the call I had been expecting finally arrived. Victor Stroud. I almost didn't answer, but something in me, maybe curiosity, maybe closure, made me swipe the screen. His voice was nothing like the cold, detached tone he used that morning. He sounded exhausted, older, and suddenly very, very human. Hadley, we need your help. I didn't respond immediately. The silence stretched until he exhaled shakily, as if the weight of the day was pressing down on him all at once. The facilities aren't communicating. The models aren't predicting anything useful. Shipments are misaligned and our clients are calling nonstop. We've never seen anything like this. You have, I said quietly. You just didn't see it because I was preventing it. He fell silent. I imagined him sitting in that Denver crisis room, surrounded by screens flashing red warnings, while executives paced behind him demanding answers he didn't have. Celeste's team believes the collapse originated from coordination gaps. The way he said it, like he finally understood what he'd thrown away, should have satisfied me. But mostly, it just confirmed how little they'd valued the truth when it mattered. Hadley, I'm asking as directly as I can. He said finally, what would it take for you to return and stabilize the grid? For a moment, I let myself remember the years I'd put into Ironvale, the nights, the sacrifices, the pride, the people who relied on me, the system I'd nurtured like it was alive. But I also remembered the 3:09 a.m. call, the dismissal, the assumption that I was replaceable, and more importantly, I remembered the meeting I'd had that afternoon. One Victor didn't know about. I can't come back, I said. I've already accepted an offer. The silence that followed wasn't just shock, it was realization. Who? He asked. Aurora Dynamics, I replied. I start next week. He inhaled sharply. Aurora wasn't just a competitor, they were the rival Ironvale feared most, and they had wanted me for years. Hadley, please reconsider. I shook my head even though he couldn't see it. You didn't need me this morning, remember? Another silence, heavier this time. I made a mistake, he admitted. A catastrophic one. Yes, I said calmly. You did. There was nothing left to say. I let him sit in that truth for a long breath before ending the call. They had believed the system would save them. They never imagined the cost of removing the person who kept it alive. And now, as Ironvale's future teetered on the edge, I walked away without looking back. 1 week after Ironvale's collapse, I walked into Aurora Dynamics headquarters in Fort Collins with a badge that read, Chief Systems Architect, a title that carried the weight of everything I'd learned and everything Ironvale had thrown away. Aurora had been watching the meltdown from a distance, not with schadenfreude, but with strategic clarity. They understood exactly what had happened, because they understood what I had been doing all those years, holding together a system that looked effortless only because I made it effortless. On my first day, the CEO, Rowan Ellery, met me personally. He didn't shake my hand with performative enthusiasm or deliver a canned welcome speech. He simply said, We know what Ironvale lost. Help us make sure we never lose the same thing. It was the first time in my entire career that someone in a corner office articulated the truth so plainly. Expertise is a strategic asset, not an expendable cost. My new team, 47 operations specialists, listened to me with the attention of people who wanted to understand the real structure beneath the charts. They asked questions Celeste never thought to ask. They walked the floor with me without complaining about noise or heat. They wanted to know why I made certain timing decisions instinctively, why I adjusted sequences before the data reflected problems, why I trusted specific suppliers even when their numbers weren't perfect. For the first time, my knowledge wasn't being treated like an outdated relic. It was being documented, expanded, integrated. The coordination framework I built for Aurora, a living system we eventually named the Rowan model, didn't rely on blind automation. It combined algorithms with human judgment, real-time feedback with learned instinct. It gave autonomy to the right people and structure to the right processes. And Aurora's grid responded like it had been waiting for this approach its entire existence. 6 months later, they became the most reliable supplier in the Mountain West. 1 year later, we won 2 of the contracts Ironvale had lost. 2 years later, our coordination metrics were being used as benchmarks across the industry. And 3 years after that 3:09 a.m. phone call, I stood on a stage in Detroit delivering a keynote at the National Manufacturing Leadership Summit. Nearly 3,000 executives, engineers, and directors filled the auditorium. Behind me, a massive screen displayed one phrase: coordination is not a protocol, it's a competence. I spoke about Ironvale without naming them. I spoke about the danger of mistaking automation for intelligence, of believing dashboards could replace understanding, of confusing optimization with leadership. And then I spoke about what happens when companies value the wrong things. When the applause came, long, sustained, almost overwhelming, I felt something settle inside me. Not triumph, not revenge, something quieter, deeper, vindication. After the keynote, more than 60 professionals approached me to ask how they could bring the Rowan model into their own operations. Some told me they were facing situations eerily similar to mine. New systems, new consultants, leadership convinced that human coordination was just a cost to eliminate. Every time, I told them the same thing: document your knowledge, quantify your impact, and never let anyone tell you that what you keep running is simple. Back in Fort Collins, I kept a framed reminder on my office bookshelf, a transcription of the 3:09 a.m. termination call. Not because I wanted to hold on to bitterness, but because it marked the moment I stopped being the person who kept a broken leadership structure alive and became the person who built something better. Ironvale, as I later learned, never recovered. Their inability to rebuild the coordination they dismantled forced them into a buyout at a fraction of their former value. Victor resigned shortly after. Celeste vanished from manufacturing entirely. But I wasn't watching their downfall anymore. I was too busy shaping the future they had been too blind to recognize. My story didn't end the night they fired me. It started there. When I look back on everything that happened, the collapse, the betrayal, the rise that followed, what stays with me isn't the drama. It's the truth I learned about people, work, and self-worth. We're taught to believe that loyalty is rewarded and hard work protects us, but in reality, many workplaces run on short memories and shallow assumptions. I spent years holding a system together so quietly that leadership forgot it needed holding at all. And that's one of life's hardest lessons. When you make something look easy, people start believing it is easy. What happened to me taught me that expertise is valuable, but only if you value it yourself first. If you rely on others to recognize your worth, you're gambling with the wrong partner. Document your contributions, speak your impact out loud, and never confuse being needed with being respected. Another lesson is that silence has power. I didn't argue when they fired me. I didn't plead my case. I didn't warn them their efficient new system was built on sand. I stepped back and let the truth reveal itself. Sometimes forgiveness frees you, but sometimes silence is the sharpest knife. It lets reality speak louder than anger ever could. The consequences Ironvale faced weren't my revenge. They were simply the price of ignoring reality. Today, workplaces everywhere are replacing humanity with shortcuts, experience with automation, people with protocols. That's why stories like mine matter. They remind us that the world still runs on human judgment, relationships, and lived knowledge. If you're going through a similar struggle, being overlooked, undervalued, or replaced by someone who doesn't understand what you do, remember this: protect your expertise, invest in yourself, and never let anyone convince you that your contribution is small. How to get started today. Write down 3 things you do at work that no one else fully sees or understands. Start keeping a small impact log, 1 sentence a day about a problem you solved or prevented. Make 1 decision this week that prioritizes your self-worth over someone else's convenience. If this story resonates with you, share your experience in the comments, subscribe for more, and let others know they're not alone.